Emily Carter was 34 years old when they decided her credibility could be adjusted quietly. Her father, Thomas Carter, 63, understood immediately what they were doing. They believed they could hurt her in a way that would never look like harm. That was the strategy. No shouting. No public humiliation. No accusation anyone could replay later. Just polished emails, scheduled reviews, and decisions wrapped carefully in the language of process. They were counting on time to finish what they started. They were counting on silence. Most of all, they were counting on memory fading. What they did not account for was a father who had spent his life studying systems and who recognized damage designed to disappear. People rely on time to erase harm they never corrected. They assume that if there is no scene, there is no wound. If no one cries publicly, then nothing serious happened. It is a comfortable illusion. Quiet harm is easy to deny because it never looks dramatic. It looks professional. It looks organized. It looks reasonable. The Carter family had always been grounded in discipline and earned respect. Their name carried steadiness, not spectacle. They were not loud people. They did not create scenes. They solved problems privately and moved forward. Stability was their identity, and until this moment, that stability had never been questioned. Emily had built her career with deliberate care. Competent, composed, and quietly successful, she had earned her position without shortcuts. She did not rely on charm or politics. She relied on preparation and results. In every performance review before this one, her record had been clean, consistent, and respected. Thomas had raised her to recognize structure over emotion. After decades as an engineer overseeing compliance and infrastructure audits, he trusted patterns more than promises. He rarely reacted impulsively. He observed. He measured. He waited. His loyalty was not loud. It was disciplined. The first fracture appeared as a standard review. It was described as routine oversight, part of updated compliance procedures. The wording was careful. The tone professional. No one accused Emily of wrongdoing. No failure was named. Yet something unmistakable shifted. Trust had quietly transformed into monitoring. Meetings were scheduled with polite smiles. Documentation was requested for alignment. Oversight expanded in increments too small to challenge individually. Nothing felt confrontational. That was precisely why it was effective. Emily responded exactly as expected. She provided records promptly. She clarified timelines. She answered questions without defensiveness. She treated the review as procedural because that is how it was framed. She believed that strong work would always correct misunderstandings. Thomas noticed what she did not say. He noticed how frequently compliance checks began appearing only in her calendar. He noticed how decisions arrived finalized before discussion. He noticed how language shifted subtly from collaboration to supervision. Words like oversight and monitoring began attaching themselves to her name with quiet consistency. There were smiles in every meeting. Professional nods. Reassurances that everything was standard procedure. No raised voices. No direct accusations. Yet her authority narrowed in ways that were difficult to articulate. Her suggestions were acknowledged, then deferred. Her independence was gradually reframed as something requiring supervision. This was not chaos. It was precision. Damage that expects to fade is engineered carefully. It avoids statements that can be quoted. It builds doubt gradually. It isolates without confrontation. It makes the target question whether anything has actually changed at all. Emily felt the shift but refused to let it affect her posture. She continued arriving early. Continued delivering measurable results. Continued speaking clearly and respectfully. If there was injustice, she would outwork it. That was her instinct. Thomas understood something deeper. When systems change tone without cause, it is rarely accidental. Weak points are introduced deliberately, reinforced quietly, protected through language. He began reviewing timelines without announcing it. He compared current review cycles to previous years. He examined policy updates line by line. He noted how standards were interpreted differently depending on who they were applied to. Each discrepancy alone appeared minor. Together, they formed a pattern too clean to dismiss as coincidence. There was no visible enemy. No one to accuse directly. Authority hid behind procedure. Every action could be defended as compliance. That was the shield. The harm was structured to be forgettable. It depended on fatigue. It depended on the hope that eventually Emily would accept the narrowed version of her role. That she would stop questioning subtle exclusions. That time would soften the memory of her prior standing. Thomas did not confront anyone. Confrontation would have provided them emotional leverage. Instead, he chose discipline. He chose timing. Something felt off, and he trusted that instinct more than polite reassurance. He studied documentation standards across comparable cases. He tracked who was reviewed and who was not. He noted inconsistencies in enforcement language. The disparities were measurable. Not explosive, but measurable. He saw the architecture clearly. Harm framed as policy survives because it appears neutral. It hides behind structure. It relies on silence to validate it. Emily still believed fairness would prevail naturally. She believed competence would re-establish trust. She believed consistency would restore equilibrium. Thomas believed in accountability. He understood immediately that this was not careless. It was calculated to be forgettable. Designed to dissolve without ever being admitted. They believed hurting his family would be forgotten. They miscalculated one thing. Thomas Carter was not a man who allowed patterns to go undocumented. Concern rarely introduces itself as control. It arrives softened, padded with reassurance, framed as protection. The tone is steady. The words are careful. Nothing sounds hostile. In fact, everything sounds responsible. That is what makes it effective. When authority shifts from trust to monitoring, it does not announce the downgrade. It describes it as support. It calls it alignment. It calls it care. Around Emily Carter, age 36, the language began to change before the outcomes did. Where once her performance had been described as independent and reliable, it was now described as closely reviewed. Where collaboration had once implied mutual trust, it was now described as structured oversight. No accusation was attached to her name. No error was cited clearly. Yet the vocabulary surrounding her role shifted just enough to alter how others perceived it. Meetings began happening without her input. Invitations were sent late or summarized afterward. Decisions arrived finalized, presented as updates rather than discussions. The justification was consistent. It was easier this way. It streamlined communication. It ensured alignment. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they created distance. Paperwork increased quietly. Additional documentation was requested, framed as routine. Benchmarks were recalibrated mid-cycle in the name of transparency. Review summaries grew longer but less specific. Where earlier assessments had celebrated measurable achievements, the newer language emphasized process adherence and observation. Oversight replaced autonomy without ever naming the transition. The community around her accepted the shift with calm efficiency. Colleagues described it as standard procedure. Leadership framed it as a protective measure designed to ensure clarity. No one described it as punishment. No one described it as doubt. They described it as thoroughness. Silence was rewarded. Emily responded with composure, providing every document requested, meeting every adjusted deadline. Her restraint was praised as professionalism. Her refusal to escalate was interpreted as maturity. The more she complied without protest, the more the system validated itself. If there were a problem, surely she would say something. If she remained calm, then everything must be appropriate. Questions, when raised by others, were redirected gently. There were no defensive reactions. Only reminders of policy. Only references to consistency. It was not personal. It was standard. That phrase repeated often enough to quiet unease. Thomas Carter, age 68, listened carefully whenever Emily summarized her day. He paid attention not only to what she described but to what she omitted. The frequency of oversight requests had increased. The autonomy she once exercised had narrowed. None of it dramatic. None of it explosive. But repetition had weight. Others dismissed his concerns as protective instinct. They told him organizations evolve. They told him increased monitoring was common in changing climates. They told him not to read too much into procedural adjustments. Their tone was kind. Their reasoning practical. Their reassurance polished. Thomas did not argue with them. He did not accuse anyone of malice. He simply observed. Patterns reveal themselves through repetition. And repetition was present. Review cycles that once occurred annually were now quarterly. Documentation standards applied to Emily were not mirrored elsewhere. Benchmarks altered mid-cycle did not appear in comparable cases. Each deviation small. Together, deliberate. Concern had become a container. It contained her authority. It contained her independence. It contained her voice within structured boundaries. The more polite the oversight appeared, the more difficult it became to challenge. Emily adapted without resentment. She believed consistency would restore balance. She believed fairness would surface eventually. Her instinct was to outperform scrutiny rather than confront it. She maintained steady posture in meetings. She continued offering ideas, even when they were redirected. She did not allow visible frustration to enter her tone. Her composure reassured the system. If she remained steady, then no harm had occurred. That is how containment stabilizes itself. Thomas understood something else. When oversight is disproportionate yet unacknowledged, it signals structural intention. Not emotional hostility. Structural intention. It creates doubt slowly enough that no single action feels worthy of dispute. It depends on fatigue. It depends on patience running out before clarity arrives. He stopped asking others for interpretation. Their responses were predictable. Instead, he began reviewing publicly available procedural standards. He compared policy language across departments. He mapped how review adjustments were implemented historically. The discrepancies were measurable. No confrontation took place. No one shouted. No reputations were openly challenged. Everything remained technically correct. That was the shield. The community framed oversight as protection. They described it as necessary vigilance. They congratulated leadership for maintaining high standards. In doing so, they normalized containment. Thomas did not interrupt this normalization. He understood timing mattered more than outrage. Emotional reaction would be dismissed as paternal bias. Documentation, however, would not. He continued listening quietly. He noted each meeting Emily was excluded from. Each decision summarized after the fact. Each instance where policy language shifted subtly around her name. He cataloged them without commentary. Emily continued believing fairness would recalibrate the imbalance. She trusted in performance. She trusted in institutional integrity. She did not yet see the full architecture forming around her. Thomas did. Oversight, when applied unevenly, is not care. It is control disguised as caution. It reframes competence as risk. It narrows authority while preserving appearance. Others called it protection. They believed the system was simply refining itself. They believed the adjustments would fade once the cycle ended. Thomas recognized containment when he saw it. What others called oversight, Thomas recognized as containment. Thomas Carter did not confront anyone. He did not send strongly worded emails or request urgent meetings. He did not escalate his concerns to friends or colleagues in the community. Public reaction would have satisfied the surface of the issue but left the structure untouched. Instead, he did something far less visible and far more deliberate. He went quiet. Silence, when chosen carefully, is not surrender. It is positioning. From the outside, nothing about Thomas's behavior suggested alarm. He continued attending community gatherings. He maintained the same measured tone when Emily updated him about her work. He did not interrupt her optimism or challenge her belief that the review process would resolve naturally. His restraint was not indifference. It was calibration. He began documenting. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Simply thoroughly. He recorded dates of meetings that excluded Emily. He saved copies of emails in which phrasing subtly shifted from collaboration to oversight. He highlighted repeated use of language such as compliance, alignment, and monitoring when referring to her projects, terms not consistently applied to others in similar roles. Patterns rarely announce themselves. They reveal themselves through repetition. Thomas compared policy applications across multiple cases within Emily's organization. Public records were accessible. Annual performance summaries were archived. Oversight measures were documented. In most instances, reviews followed predictable timelines and clear benchmarks. In Emily's case, timelines shortened unexpectedly. Benchmarks shifted mid-cycle. Evaluation criteria expanded without formal notice. Each change, taken alone, appeared minor. Together, they formed alignment too precise to dismiss. He tracked email phrasing carefully. Earlier correspondence described Emily as dependable and autonomous. Later messages inserted qualifiers. Words like support replaced lead. Collaboration was reframed as supervision. The transformation was gradual enough to avoid attention. It was also consistent enough to reveal intent. Systems protect themselves by appearing neutral. Thomas understood this instinctively. Neutrality is often the most effective shield. No one needs to raise their voice when policy can do the work quietly. Authority becomes impersonal. Responsibility disperses into process. Harm hides inside documentation. Emily remained unaware of the full structural targeting unfolding around her. She sensed tension but attributed it to routine change. She adjusted her workflow, complied with expanded reporting requirements, and reassured herself that transparency would eventually quiet doubt. She believed in merit. She believed that continued excellence would restore equilibrium. Thomas believed in evidence. He reviewed policy application across comparable departments. In at least 3 similar cases, minor discrepancies had been resolved with informal clarification. No extended monitoring. No repeated compliance reviews. No additional paperwork cycles. The disparity was measurable. He did not assume motive. He focused on structure. Long-game discipline requires emotional restraint. There were moments when frustration surfaced, when the urge to intervene directly rose in him. But reaction without documentation would weaken credibility. Timing mattered more than emotion. He watched and waited. Silence shifted from absence to strategy. When acquaintances suggested that Emily's expanded oversight was simply part of organizational growth, Thomas nodded without arguing. When others described the process as protective rather than restrictive, he did not contradict them publicly. Disagreement too early would alert the very structure he was studying. He understood that containment often masquerades as care. The documentation expanded methodically. He created timelines comparing the onset of oversight with prior positive evaluations. He charted when decision-making authority narrowed. He noted instances where meetings occurred without Emily's input but resulted in directives affecting her projects. The pattern tightened. What appeared random was not random. Repetition formed a rhythm. Reviews clustered unusually. Feedback cycles overlapped in ways that increased scrutiny without clear justification. Oversight did not expand across the organization uniformly. It concentrated around her. Systems appear neutral when viewed superficially. Under examination, neutrality reveals preference. Thomas resisted sharing his findings prematurely. Emily needed to continue her work without the burden of suspicion shaping her confidence. Protection sometimes requires invisibility. His role was not to inflame, but to preserve. The long game solidified. He began organizing documentation chronologically, cross-referenced against formal policy language. Where deviation occurred, he highlighted it. Where phrasing changed tone, he archived it. Where standards applied inconsistently, he marked it. The accumulation of small discrepancies created a structural silhouette. Timing became critical. Acting too soon would allow the system to adjust defensively. Waiting too long would allow the pattern to harden beyond correction. Precision was essential. Emily continued moving forward with composure. Her professionalism remained intact. Her tone in meetings remained steady. She adapted to increased oversight without visible resistance. Her emotional restraint was interpreted by others as acceptance. In truth, it was endurance. Thomas recognized the risk of fatigue. That was the design. Quiet harm relies on exhaustion. It counts on the target eventually internalizing doubt or growing tired of compliance. It relies on time blurring original trust. He refused to let time do their work. The documentation reached a threshold where coincidence became statistically improbable. Policy deviations aligned with specific decision-makers. Review language shifted after particular administrative transitions. Oversight increased immediately following internal promotions unrelated to her performance. The pattern was not chaotic. It was engineered. Thomas closed his laptop one evening with clarity rather than anger. He understood that public confrontation would satisfy emotion but leave the structure intact. Evidence, presented properly and at the correct moment, would do what reaction could not. Silence had gathered weight. What others dismissed as routine oversight now existed in documented contrast. What appeared as concern revealed containment. What looked neutral exposed preference. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. Thomas Carter did not begin this phase with anger. He began it with comparison. After months of quiet documentation, careful observation, and disciplined restraint, he understood that emotion would cloud what evidence could clarify. If there was imbalance, it would not appear in tone or facial expression. It would appear in structure. So he set aside assumption and focused entirely on measurable patterns. He requested publicly available policy applications. He reviewed compliance procedures from prior years. He examined timelines not just for Emily, but for other professionals in similar roles. The results did not announce themselves dramatically. There were no glaring violations, no reckless decisions that could be pointed to and labeled misconduct. Instead, there were subtle deviations. Small shifts. Adjustments applied in one case but not another. Emily's oversight reviews had increased in frequency without a documented trigger. Performance benchmarks had been recalibrated mid-cycle, though policy stated adjustments required cause. Monitoring language appeared in her evaluations months earlier than in comparable cases. On paper, each action appeared reasonable. Together, they formed a structure too specific to dismiss. Verbal reassurances had been generous. She had been told repeatedly that everything was routine, that the additional oversight was protective, that the expanded documentation requirements were simply part of an updated standard. But when Thomas aligned policy text beside procedural implementation, the symmetry disappeared. The rules had not changed across the board. They had narrowed selectively. He did not name individuals. He did not assign motive. Motive is subjective. Structure is not. He highlighted only what could be proven. Enforcement timelines. Compliance triggers. Language consistency. Where one employee received collaborative feedback, Emily received supervisory correction. Where others were granted autonomy with minor revisions, she was assigned additional review layers. Authority, he realized, does not need to shout to assert control. It only needs to apply process unevenly. The paper trails were precise. Email phrasing shifted gradually from trust-based collaboration to conditional oversight. Meetings referencing alignment appeared in her calendar without prior request. Documentation requirements expanded without formal policy revision. Every adjustment was defensible. None were accidental. Thomas felt something settle within him. Not anger. Not resentment. Clarity. He had once believed the harm might be personal. That someone had taken offense or misinterpreted her confidence. But the evidence suggested something broader. The pattern was embedded in process. It was not about personality. It was about power distribution within structure. Emily remained unaware of the full scope of his findings. She continued navigating her environment with professionalism, attributing new demands to workload shifts and evolving expectations. She believed that consistency would restore equilibrium. Thomas saw that equilibrium had been recalibrated intentionally. Procedure, when used selectively, becomes invisible enforcement. He laid out documentation chronologically. A timeline of adjustments that mirrored no official change in policy. He marked how oversight expanded only after a leadership transition, yet remained confined to her division. He noted how performance metrics were interpreted differently depending on who was being reviewed. The disparities were small enough to avoid outrage, but consistent enough to establish pattern. No one had openly accused her of wrongdoing. That was part of the architecture. Accusations invite defense. Process invites compliance. By avoiding direct criticism, the structure insulated itself from confrontation. He recognized something essential: harm that hides inside institutional language rarely presents itself as cruelty. It presents as governance. The emotional clarity that followed did not feel triumphant. It felt sobering. The issue was no longer about protecting his daughter's reputation from rumor. It was about exposing imbalance within a system that prided itself on neutrality. And neutrality, when applied unevenly, ceases to be neutral. Thomas resisted the urge to confront. Evidence requires timing. Too early, and it is dismissed as speculation. Too late, and the pattern hardens beyond correction. He continued organizing documentation, ensuring that every claim could be supported without interpretation. The community surrounding Emily had reframed the oversight as diligence. Colleagues described it as careful leadership. They praised transparency without noticing its asymmetry. Emotional restraint was admired as maturity. Silence was mistaken for stability. But Thomas understood that stability built on imbalance does not endure. He prepared a comparison matrix, aligning enforcement actions across cases. The discrepancies were subtle yet undeniable. Similar performance evaluations resulted in divergent administrative responses. Documentation thresholds differed. Supervisory involvement intensified without clear policy justification. There were no villains to name. Only choices embedded within structure. And that distinction mattered. When wrongdoing is institutional, correction must also be institutional. Outrage would only personalize the issue. Documentation would universalize it. Emily's standing, he realized, had never truly been about her competence. It had become a variable within a broader recalibration of authority. She had been positioned as an example of oversight, not because she failed, but because the system required demonstration of control. That understanding did not break him. It steadied him. He gathered the evidence cleanly. He removed emotional language. He excluded assumption. He focused exclusively on measurable disparity. If the system valued procedure, then procedure would be the vehicle for correction. The harm was no longer abstract. It was mapped. For months, the narrative had implied that Emily required monitoring. The documentation now suggested something different. Monitoring had required her. Thomas closed the final file with quiet resolve. The evidence was organized, aligned, and unambiguous. The situation had shifted from personal injury to institutional imbalance. The issue was no longer Emily's performance, it was systemic imbalance. Thomas Carter understood that accusation weakens when it arrives before proof. By the time he moved, he had no interest in confrontation. He was not looking for apology, acknowledgement, or emotional release. He was looking for correction. The evidence he had gathered over months did not rely on interpretation. It relied on comparison, repetition, and measurable deviation from policy. What had once felt personal had revealed itself as structural. And structural problems demand procedural response. He prepared his documentation carefully. Timelines were organized chronologically. Email phrasing was highlighted only where language shifted meaning. Policy excerpts were attached beside examples of inconsistent enforcement. He removed any commentary that suggested motive. There were no emotional descriptions, no references to how Emily felt, no narrative about fairness. The submission contained only structure against structure. Process measured against process. The formal complaint was submitted through internal compliance channels designed specifically for irregular procedural enforcement. It did not accuse individuals. It questioned consistency. It did not challenge authority. It asked for clarification of application standards. The tone was measured, clinical, and precise. It required no interpretation. Oversight mechanisms responded the way they were built to respond, automatically. A preliminary review notice was issued internally, requesting documentation across comparable cases. Administrative staff were required to produce archived evaluation materials. Timelines were reconstructed. Enforcement patterns were analyzed without fanfare. No announcement was made. No meeting was scheduled publicly. The system began quietly examining itself. Emily remained unaware of the scope of this review. She continued her work with the same restraint she had maintained from the beginning. She still believed that performance would stabilize perception. She did not know that her father had already shifted the ground beneath the process that sought to contain her. Thomas did not tell her. Not yet. Timing remained essential. Internally, something changed. Managers who had once used oversight casually began rereading policy language more carefully. Documentation requests increased, not for Emily alone, but across departments. Language in correspondence became more neutral. Where monitoring had previously been framed as precaution, it was now documented as justification. Authority did not withdraw, but it recalibrated. Silence, which had once protected selective enforcement, grew heavier. Oversight bodies requested clarification on variance between Emily's review schedule and comparable employees. They examined how frequently performance benchmarks had been revised mid-cycle. They noted discrepancies in how informal feedback had been documented selectively. Each discovery stood independently, but together they formed something undeniable. No one accused Emily directly. No one admitted error. Yet the internal audit required explanation. Thomas did not attend any of these discussions. He did not insert himself into meetings. His role ended the moment documentation entered formal channels. That was the discipline of the long game. Once the system begins reviewing itself, external presence becomes unnecessary. Intervention would have diluted credibility. Silence maintained strength. The compliance review extended beyond Emily's file. It traced patterns across multiple departments. Inconsistent application of monitoring procedures surfaced elsewhere. What had appeared isolated now revealed repetition. The issue no longer centered on one employee's standing. It centered on structural imbalance. Subtle pressure built. Authority figures who had relied on ambiguous language now faced requirement for measurable consistency. Decisions that once arrived finalized now required documented rationale. Review schedules were standardized. Communication templates were revised to remove interpretive phrasing. Nothing dramatic occurred. No announcement acknowledged change. Yet the system adjusted. Emily began noticing minor shifts. Meetings included her earlier in planning stages. Documentation requests stabilized. Monitoring language softened. There were no apologies. No explanations. The tone simply returned to neutral. Thomas watched quietly. He did not interpret these shifts as victory. Correction is not vindication. It is alignment. His intention had never been to embarrass anyone or to force confession. It was to restore structural fairness without spectacle. The absence of drama confirmed effectiveness. Within compliance offices, internal memoranda acknowledged the need for standardized enforcement to avoid perception of selective monitoring. The language remained careful, procedural. No names were attached publicly. No disciplinary headlines followed. Instead, quiet recalibration replaced inconsistency. The silence that once shielded them began turning against them. When systems are required to examine themselves, concealment weakens. Oversight becomes mutual rather than directional. Documentation, once used to isolate, becomes shared accountability. The very tools that had narrowed Emily's authority now demanded universal application. Thomas remained patient. He did not seek recognition. He did not inform Emily of his submission yet. He understood that premature disclosure might burden her emotionally. What mattered was outcome, not credit. Protection does not require acknowledgement to remain meaningful. Internally, the review concluded with recommendations for standardized monitoring intervals and policy clarification. These recommendations were implemented without public notice. They were presented as efficiency improvements rather than corrections. No individual responsibility was assigned. The system protected its personnel while adjusting its procedures. And yet, the imbalance shifted. Emily's next performance review arrived on schedule, aligned with departmental norms. The language returned to objective measurement. No unusual compliance footnotes appeared. No additional oversight clauses were appended. The subtle containment that had defined previous cycles dissolved without comment. Thomas understood the weight of quiet correction. Justice that relies on spectacle rarely endures. Justice that embeds itself into structure lasts longer. He stored the final correspondence confirming policy alignment and closed his documentation file. Not because the memory had faded, but because the structure had stabilized. The long game does not end with exposure. It ends with balance. What had once felt isolating to Emily now felt neutral. Stability returned without apology. Authority recalibrated without admission. The harm that expected to fade had been met with precision instead of outrage. Silence had shifted allegiance. The very procedural shield that once concealed selective enforcement now demanded transparency. Those who relied on quiet containment now operated within clarified boundaries. No one celebrated. No one acknowledged the turning point openly. But within internal corridors, the weight of documentation lingered. The silence that once protected them began turning against them. Justice rarely announces itself when it is done properly. It does not enter the room with apologies or speeches. It does not correct the record in public or demand acknowledgement. When justice is clean, it appears as adjustment, as recalibration, as policy suddenly applied the way it always should have been applied. The loudest part of it is often the silence that follows. The first shift was procedural. Language that had once surrounded Emily Carter's name, monitoring, review, oversight, began to disappear from documentation. Performance reports returned to neutral phrasing. Evaluation timelines aligned once again with institutional standards instead of deviating without explanation. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. But the tone shifted. The scrutiny that had once seemed constant became measured. Then it became normal. No one announced the adjustment. No one referenced the prior inconsistencies. There were no internal memos acknowledging error. The system did not confess. It corrected. Emily noticed the operational differences before she named them. Meetings once held without her input were now scheduled with her participation. Decisions that had previously arrived finalized now included consultation. Her authority returned not through praise, but through access. Through restored autonomy. Through the simple fact that her professional space expanded back to its original dimensions. Externally, nothing appeared unusual. Colleagues maintained their composure. Professionalism remained intact. There were no visible signs of upheaval. That was the integrity of procedural consequence. It did not humiliate, it adjusted. Internally, however, subtle realignments unfolded. Oversight committees revisited documentation standards. Compliance protocols were clarified and applied consistently across departments. Cases previously reviewed under vague criteria were re-examined for alignment. Those responsible for selective enforcement found their authority narrowed quietly, not revoked but redistributed. The individuals who had relied on ambiguity began experiencing structure applied to themselves. Their decisions were no longer insulated by discretionary interpretation. Review mechanisms now required transparency in areas once left unexamined. They did not protest. They adapted. Systems protect stability above pride. Emily's professional standing recalibrated without announcement. Opportunities previously withheld resurfaced organically. Invitations extended without hesitation. Her expertise was referenced again in strategic discussions. The restoration was not theatrical. It was structural. Thomas Carter observed this transition without expression. He did not seek validation. He did not hint at involvement. His documentation had moved through proper channels months earlier, triggering oversight that required no personal testimony. He understood something many overlook: systems respond to evidence more reliably than to outrage. He remained quiet. There were no meetings between him and institutional leaders. No private acknowledgements. No gratitude extended. That absence did not trouble him. The goal had never been recognition. It had been balance. Justice that lasts does not humiliate, it stabilizes. The silence that once protected selective enforcement now carried weight. Where ambiguity had once shielded uneven application, clarity exposed it. Staff became more precise with language. Documentation became more consistent. Oversight no longer clustered around a single name. It distributed evenly, as policy intended. The professional environment shifted from containment to equilibrium. Emily sensed the difference in her body before her mind articulated it. The subtle tension she had carried for months eased without her consciously deciding to release it. Conversations regained ease. Her contributions were received without guarded review. Performance metrics returned to standard cadence. She did not ask why. She accepted the shift with quiet gratitude and continued working. She believed the system had corrected itself. Thomas understood correction rarely happened spontaneously. He reflected on the months prior, the careful documentation, the restraint, the patience required to let patterns solidify before presenting them. Timing had mattered. Evidence had required repetition to become undeniable. Had he acted too early, it would have appeared reactive. Too late, and the damage would have calcified. Precision had protected the outcome. Within the institution, those who had initiated selective oversight experienced reassignment framed as operational restructuring. Titles shifted slightly. Responsibilities adjusted. Authority narrowed in areas where inconsistency had surfaced. No one was publicly censured. No scandal erupted. Stability remained intact. Yet the message was clear within the system: procedure would no longer be selective. Professional recalibration replaced quiet harm. Emily's record reflected continuity rather than interruption. The months of increased monitoring were absorbed into normal progression without permanent stain. The attempt to diminish her standing through accumulation of doubt dissolved in the presence of documented equity. Thomas never revealed his involvement. Not to colleagues. Not to extended family. Not even immediately to Emily. Protection does not require witness to be valid. He understood that revealing the strategy would shift focus back to conflict. Silence preserved dignity. He watched her walk into a meeting one afternoon with posture fully restored. No hesitation. No guarded calculation. Only competence. The harm had expected to fade. Instead, accountability had stabilized. There were no victory speeches. No triumphant confrontations. No exposed villains. Just structure operating as it should. Justice, when done properly, does not look dramatic. It looks ordinary. It looks like policy working. It looks like neutrality applied evenly. It looks like nothing happened at all. And that is why it lasts. Emily sensed the shift, the quiet restoration of professional gravity. She felt equilibrium return without understanding its origin. She believed the season of scrutiny had simply passed. Thomas allowed her that belief. He understood something deeper. They had expected time to erase what they did. Instead, time had revealed it. And the correction had been clean. Emily sensed the shift, but she didn't yet know why it happened. By the time the structure around her began to shift, Emily Carter was 36 years old, steady in her posture and careful with her conclusions. The oversight language that had once followed her name began to fade from meeting summaries. Monitoring phrases disappeared from documentation. Autonomy returned not through announcement, but through silence. The change was subtle enough that anyone outside the pattern would have missed it. Emily did not celebrate it. She studied it. She understood that something had recalibrated, but she did not yet understand how. What had once required repeated clarification now required none. Decisions once delayed by review moved forward without hesitation. The atmosphere that had quietly questioned her judgment no longer pressed against her. Her work had not changed. Her preparation had not intensified. Only the environment had adjusted. She reflected without bitterness. That was the first sign of growth. The experience had sharpened her perception without hardening her spirit. She did not look back at the months of scrutiny with resentment. Instead, she analyzed them with clarity. She recognized how easily authority can shift tone without shifting language. How concern can operate without accusation. How silence can isolate without declaring itself. That understanding did not make her angry. It made her disciplined. Across the institution, something else had changed. Policies that once appeared flexible were now applied with consistency. Documentation standards were aligned across departments. Oversight procedures that had once focused narrowly now widened evenly. The system, almost imperceptibly, had begun correcting itself. No meeting was called to explain it. No public memo announced a reform. The adjustments arrived quietly, embedded in routine updates. Within that quiet, a different form of accountability settled. There were no confessions, no apologies, no declarations of error. Instead, there were structural realignments. Internal responsibilities shifted. Certain decision-makers were reassigned to less influential roles. Review processes were redistributed across committees rather than concentrated in select hands. The institution did not admit fault. It redistributed pressure. Emily sensed the moral recalibration without demanding recognition. She did not pursue vindication. She did not seek to expose those who had once tightened oversight around her. She understood something essential: justice that endures does not require humiliation. It requires durability. Her professional standing stabilized not because someone defended her publicly, but because records could no longer contradict her competence. Thomas Carter, now 65, watched the outcome from a distance he had intentionally maintained. His loyalty had never been loud. He had never confronted authority in hallways or drafted emotional letters demanding explanation. His discipline had been measured in patience. He had chosen documentation over defense. Timing over reaction. Structure over spectacle. Emily began to recognize the quiet consistency of that protection. She noticed the questions he asked in passing about review timelines months earlier. The calm way he had requested copies of procedural language. The way he had encouraged her to keep meticulous records without dramatizing why. His presence during the months of pressure had been steady, not reactive. He had not told her to fight. He had told her to stay consistent. That was loyalty measured by patience. Within the institution, a different kind of reflection occurred. Those who had once relied on selective enforcement began reconsidering how easily procedure can become a shield. No one admitted wrongdoing. But responsibility shifted in tone. Meetings became more transparent. Review processes were distributed rather than centralized. Oversight language, once applied narrowly, was recalibrated broadly. The system learned without confessing. Guilt did not manifest as apology. It manifested as correction. That distinction mattered. It transformed discomfort into responsibility. Rather than defending prior decisions, leadership focused on preventing repetition. It was not dramatic. It was deliberate. Emily felt the change in the texture of conversations. Where there had once been a careful distance, there was now professional parity. Her input carried its original weight. Her decisions moved forward without layered supervision. Trust, once narrowed, expanded quietly back to its original dimension. She did not ask who had intervened. She did not need to. The pattern had been too precise to reverse on its own. Someone had studied it. Someone had timed the correction carefully enough that it left no fingerprints. At home, the Carter family returned to its familiar rhythm. Dinners remained steady. Conversations returned to work and ordinary life. There were no victory speeches. No retelling of institutional missteps. Thomas did not claim involvement. He did not frame himself as protector. He simply asked whether her workload felt balanced again. Protection, in that household, was defined as consistency. Emily began reframing her experience in a way that surprised even her. Instead of viewing the months of scrutiny as an attack, she began seeing them as a lesson in structural awareness. She learned how quickly systems can narrow focus. How easily neutrality can disguise imbalance. How vital documentation becomes when tone shifts without explanation. The experience refined her leadership rather than diminishing it. Moral calm settled gradually. It did not erupt into relief. It deepened into steadiness. The Carter family had weathered pressure without spectacle. They had relied on timing rather than confrontation. The bond between father and daughter strengthened not because he defended her publicly, but because he trusted her resilience enough to act strategically. Loyalty revealed itself through patience, not volume. Yet even as the system stabilized and the emotional tension softened, one detail remained unresolved in Thomas's mind. There was one procedural adjustment still incomplete. One structural correction that would determine whether this balance was temporary or permanent. He understood that justice secured once must be secured again through prevention. The atmosphere felt calmer. The immediate imbalance had been corrected. But true durability required one final step. But one final correction still remained. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly, without apology, without explanation. Meetings continued. Reports were filed. Calendars filled. To anyone watching from the outside, the tension that once surrounded Emily Carter's name appeared to dissolve. Oversight language faded. Monitoring cycles returned to standard intervals. Her authority, once narrowed by polite containment, resumed its full scope through documentation rather than discussion. Nothing dramatic marked the change. That was the point. Justice, when done properly, does not need an audience. They had relied on time to erase what they did. That had been the strategy from the beginning. Harm structured carefully enough, framed professionally enough, would lose its edges. Doubt would soften into memory. Concern would be remembered as caution. And eventually, no one would question the shift that had once isolated her. Time is often used as an accomplice in quiet damage. It carries people forward before they have the chance to look back. But time does not erase structure. It preserves it. What changed was not just Emily's standing. What changed was the system itself. Policies that had once been applied selectively were now reviewed through automated compliance triggers. Oversight protocols required uniform documentation across departments. Review committees operated under transparent timelines. Language that had once been elastic tightened under consistency requirements. None of these changes were announced publicly. They were introduced as refinements, adjustments, efficiency improvements. But they were safeguards. Prevention replaced reaction. Emily felt the stability before she understood its origin. Invitations returned to collaborative rather than supervisory tones. Meetings included her input before decisions were finalized. Her work was evaluated under the same metrics applied to others. No one apologized. No one admitted error. And she did not require them to. The correction existed in the record, not in rhetoric. Her authority was not restored through sympathy. It was restored through alignment. Thomas Carter watched the shift with the same discipline he had maintained from the beginning. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not disclose his involvement. His documentation had traveled through proper channels, activating processes designed for precisely this purpose. Once triggered, those processes could not ignore clean evidence. Institutions protect themselves, but they also correct themselves when structure demands it. He had trusted that mechanism. Justice, he understood, is durable when it alters foundation rather than surface. There were no victory speeches. No confrontations. The individuals who had relied on procedure as shield were reassigned quietly within compliance frameworks. Responsibility did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as recalibration. Their authority narrowed in areas where discretion had once been unchecked. Oversight applied to them with the same consistency previously withheld. The system did not retaliate. It balanced. Emily's future stabilized not because someone defended her loudly, but because someone ensured the structure could no longer bend selectively. Her reputation no longer depended on goodwill. It rested on measurable policy alignment. That stability felt different than reassurance. It felt earned. Thomas remained invisible in the architecture of correction. His name did not appear in memos. His involvement did not surface in conversation. He had not acted for recognition. He had acted for durability. Protection, to him, meant ensuring that what harmed once could not repeat. That is the difference between reaction and prevention. The Carter family did not celebrate. They resumed their rhythm. Emily reflected on the experience with clarity rather than resentment. She recognized how easily harm can hide behind professionalism. She recognized how restraint can be mistaken for surrender. But she also understood something else now, that accountability can outlast damage when someone is patient enough to let evidence speak. Time had not erased what was done. It had revealed it. The quiet correction reshaped more than one case. It adjusted expectations across the institution. Colleagues began documenting processes more carefully. Language became more precise. Oversight committees referenced updated standards automatically. The culture did not transform overnight, but it shifted just enough to prevent repetition. That was enough. Reflective stillness settled where tension once lived. Not relief exactly. Not triumph. Something steadier. A recognition that justice does not need spectacle to be real. It needs endurance. Harm may wait, assuming memory will fade. Accountability can wait longer. Thomas understood that truth deeply. He had not rushed to intervene when emotion tempted him. He had not reacted to provocation. He had watched. Documented. Timed. And when he moved through systems designed to preserve integrity. The result was not loud. It was lasting. Emily never asked who had altered the current beneath her feet. She did not need to. She felt the steadiness return and chose to meet it with the same composure she had always carried. Strength, she realized, does not require confrontation. It requires alignment. The world around them resumed its ordinary pace. Emails continued. Reviews were scheduled. Policies were followed. But the structure beneath those actions had changed in subtle, permanent ways. That was the correction. They believed time would erase what they did. They underestimated a man willing to outlast it,